Thank you. My name is Peter Goddard. This is my story. I did this a long time ago, and I kept no notes on it, and I never ever did hear the version they did do, so good luck on what I'm going to tell you again today. I was born in 1936 in Victoria, but first a report on how our family got to Victoria. Peter Grass was my fourth great-grandfather. It was when the American Revolution back in the 1770s was coming to an end. At the end of it resulted in the British having to leave New York. Peter Grass was given the captainship of a ship load of evacuees away from New York across. He sailed up the Atlantic coast to Canada and up the St. Lawrence River to a spot well inland where King George IV created land grants for new immigrants and called refugees. The area became known as Kingston. That's where the city of Kingston is now. That's where our group started off from. When the settlers took root, it was in 1871 when my grandmother was born. When she was 2 years old, the family chose to immigrate to a place called Calgary. They came on the first phase of using the CPR railway being built at the time. And the last half of the journey was by covered wagon through to Alberta. Alberta didn't become Alberta until 1905, actually. Gilbert Goddard immigrated from Devon, England, via San Francisco in the 1870s, and he started the Bow River Horse Ranch, which was at the Cochrane in the Northern Territories. Alberta hadn't been created yet. The ranch was adjacent to 5 miles of the Bow River. He was a friend of Peter Grass, and became engaged to Luella when she was 19. This was in 1900. They had 4 children, of which my father, Victor, was the first, born in the late 1900s. He was to be named Edwin Llewellyn Goddard, but the story is on their way to be his christening, the late Queen Victoria had passed away, so they added Victor to the beginning of his name, so it became Victor Edwin Llewellyn Goddard, in memory of the Queen. The ranch supplied horses to the RCMP, or the Mounted Police, and also supplied horses to the troops heading to Europe during the First World War. In the 1918, with the development of automobiles or trucks in those days, a need for horses diminished. The ranch was sold and the family moved to Sydney. Victor and Everett were homeschooled on the ranch up to the age of 10, then sent Victor and his brother to attend the new St. Michael Boys' School in Victoria. He hated it. Being homeschooled out on the open ranch was a whole lot nicer than being in a private school where the rule was, where the cane ruled everybody. Victor remembers traveling to Sydney on the Cordwood Limited, the VNS Railroad. That's the end of the written part. Now I go into where do I go from here? Victor grew up and carried on in Sydney. He and Freeman King and Victor lived in Sydney, and they started the scout troop there in 1920. That was back in the beginnings of scouting days, and they did it for. They were in Sydney for Victor was in Sydney for 10 years before he moved on. He was a customs officer at the Sydney docks prior to that, and then he was transferred to the Victoria Customs House. And as he lived much closer to Victoria now, he looked for a piece of property, and he bought property on what is now called Halliburton Road. And it was it was 6 acres, and the previous owners had abandoned it because of the Depression. And the price he had to pay 3 years of taxes owing, which was $45. And the Hudson's Bay had a lien on the property for $20 for an unpaid grocery bill. So for $65, he got the 6 acres. Imagine doing that now. And the road, South Halliburton Road, Miss Bainbridge Smith, she was the first person who developed land on which at that time was called Lakes Road. On the early maps, it's called Lakes Road. And she built a girls' school. I don't have that paper here. It's over there. She had a school for girls who came out from England to learn how to be farmers, because there are so many local boys around here looking for wives and farmers that she decided she'd train them as how to become farmers, and apparently it worked very well. So she renamed the road Halliburton because it was her uncle, Judge Halliburton in England, that had donated most of the funds for this property. So that's why it became Halliburton. One of the girls who was trained there was Shirley Robinson. Told me her mother learned how to be a farmer at that school. And the ridge, up on the ridge, we call it the ridge up on the top of the Halliburton Hill, there's a lot of cabins scattered all through the forest, all occupied by bachelors. And one of them, there are different ones. One of the ones I knew very well was Walter Polson and Jimmy Muldoon and the Stevenson brothers, and there's Mr. and they're scattered all over the ridge there. But Walter Polson, I became great friends with him when I was about 6 years old. I would go over to his place pretty well every day and stay with him, as he had a team of horses, and he provided he did all the plowing and the cultivating for all the neighbors in that area, and we'd go trooping off on his wagon and off to do the work. And his cabin was just a shack, but he had no electricity, no phone, no electricity, so it was great fun visiting Walter. There was one trip we did. He said he was going down to visit his parents in the Keating, on Hunt Road, where the Polson farm was. He was going there for dinner. He was invited for dinner on one Sunday afternoon. So he said, "Do you want to come?" So I said, "Sure." So into the two-wheeled cart we got, with the one horse pulling it, and off up East Saanich Road and down Savory Road all the way down into the valley. We had our dinner there, and then when it was time to come home, it was getting dark. So my job was to hold the lantern at the back of the cart to wave in case any traffic came up from behind. You try doing that now. On East Saanich Road, and we got home. I think only about 2 cars came up behind us at that time. This is back in the early 40s. Jimmy Muldoon was another one. He was one of our next door neighbors. He came as a carpenter on the CPR ships when they were sending them over from England to Victoria, Victoria, like the Princess Kathleen and the Princess Mary and all that, Joan. He was a carpenter on one of those ships, and he helped build the railings on the ships as they sailed across from England over to BC. But anyway, he had a farm there. He had a lot of fruit. He grew a lot of fruit, but I think he preserved most of it in the form of booze. But one day he came over to our place, greatly upset. He'd gone in the house and he said, "There's a hole in my floor, and there's smoke coming up out of it." So Dad said, "That can't be right." So I remember walking over to Jimmy's place, and Dad said, "Did you ever look up?" There was a hole in the roof 6 inches in diameter. It was one of these practice bombs that it accidentally dropped during the war years, and it came down through his house, through the floor. And there was another one of those 6 bombs that dropped was through a house on the beach at Courtray near McMorran's. It went through the ladies' kitchen sink. That one did. But they were just practice bombs. There's no explosives in them. But the 2 of the war stories we have from that part. Anyway, Jimmy was not perplexed by it. He just climbed up on the roof, and he was a carpenter, so he fixed the roof and patched the floor, and everything went carried on. Dad, another one was Dad had made a barrel of apple cider, and it was down in the basement. And Jimmy came over one day because Dad said that cider is gradually disappearing. And one day after a winter storm, the basement had about a foot of water in it, and Jimmy complained that he got his feet wet when he went into our basement. Well, that's where Dad's barrel of cider is going. It's Jimmy. But Jimmy didn't like getting his feet wet. All right, carrying on. In 1942, the Winterburns moved into the the Bainbridge Smith house home. It was a big house up on top of on Wesley and Halliburton Road. And George Winterburn was the boy. He was the same age as I was, and he and I became great pals. We went everywhere and did everything for about 10 years, I guess, before we all grew up and had to do other things. But we would range all over through up over the hill and down through the across all the, well, the name of the field down there. Anyway, up over the hill, and there was one hill we called Bald Mountain. We climbed up over that, and there was a hole on the side of it, on the far side of it, that had been started as a copper mine. Somebody thought they'd found copper and they were going to mine it, and this hole was, the mine was full of water. It was up to the top. Anyway, the rest of the boys, by George Varley and the Bramwell brothers, they decided they were going to drain it. So all the boys in the neighborhood were all requested to bring garden hoses up, and we hooked them all together, and we gradually siphoned the water out of that copper mine, and it went down into the rock about 50 feet with a big cavern at the bottom in the end when we finally got it all drained out. But apparently the copper part never materialized, so they just abandoned it. But we drained. There's pictures over there that showing where the entrance to that mine is. Anyway, I started grade 1 at the old Royal Oak School. I remember the day Dad dropped my brother Gordon, who was 4 years older than I was. He dropped us off at the post office, which was on East Saanich Road, which is just above where the Petrocan can is now. That's where the post office was. He dropped us off there, and Gordon and I walk across the kitty corner across over the foundations where the hotel had been, and we'd go up into the school. And Gordon said, "You go up that little room." I never got to. He said, "You go up the steps of that one room over there, and that's where you're going." He was in grade 4. He was going to the big school next door. But I remember going in there, and Miss Adamson was the teacher at the time, and there was 3 grades. There was grade 1s in 2 rows, and grade 2s in 2 more rows, and there was a row of grade 3s. There was three grades in that room, and one of the things we did in there was, being the warriors, each student had a gas mask, which we hung on the coat hooks out in the hallway in case there's needed them. And occasionally there'd be an air raid practice where the school bell would just ding, 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 and all the students would get up and walk out and walk across West Saanich Road and down into a gully, more or less behind where the Women's Institute Hall. That would have been where the VNS railway track had been. It's in there on their embankment. They all crouched down in there until the all clear bell came, and then we threw back up to school and carry on. And the other thing we used to do at the school is we used to have sports days, and we'd walk up the Pipeline Road up to Beaver Lake, where they had a cement pad, and we'd do all our races on that pad. Anyway, I was at Royal Oak for 4 years. Then this is in 1947 or 48. They built a new school at Cordova Bay, so all the students who lived up on the ridge area were to go to Cordova Bay. So we went to Cordova Bay for grade 6 for 1 year, and after that, we had to go to Mount Newton for grade 7, and we took the school bus out. They had a new school bus which we got to ride out to the school, and we were there for grade 7 and 8, and that school got too full. They were going to start using the gymnasium for a classroom, and they said, and they came up with, we are now going to go to North Saanich High School because it had room for us. So all the students that lived along East Saanich, Royal Oak and East Saanich Road on the bus line were to go out to North Saanich. So we went to North Saanich for 2 years. That's out past the airport. And eventually they rebuilt the school back at Royal Oak, and I came back for grade 11 and 12 at Royal Oak again. So at one point we knew the whole area. And also another thing during the war years, they had blackout curtains on the houses. And my dad was also one of the air raid wardens, and he had to go. He and Francis Tuckey over in Santa Clara, they would go out and check on houses to make sure no light was shining, could be seen from the roads or from you had these blackout curtains because they were afraid. They didn't want to create a way to be shot at. So we had blackout curtains for the rest of the war there. And where did we get to? Well, also, Victor, my father, when he moved from Sydney out to got married. He got married on 1931. He started the Royal Oak Scout Troop, and he looked after that. Royal Oak Scouts went until he retired in 1954 from that. He was involved in Scouts most of his life, and the Scout Hall is down here on end of Markham, across the Markham Road on West Saanich Road. They'd built a Scout Hall down there for the boys, but there again there was many trips, hiking trips. I never actually. I was a cub for many years, but I had enough of Scout, that sort of thing, so I never actually became a Scout, but I was involved in all their activities. But where did we get to here? Oh, another thing I did was, when the Winterburns moved in up there, George and I became these great pals, and we did everything, and we would help. One of our jobs was picking berries and fruit for the summer. So one year we'd pick. We started picking peas in the crop. Then we went to strawberries. Then we went to cherries and apples and stuff. And in the summer blackberry season was going. So we were busy picking. We and the other people were picking the blackberries on the farm there. But there's one section we wouldn't pick. Why aren't you picking those berries, Mr. Amos asked. And they said, well, there's a big wasp nest in there. It's a foot in diameter. We're not going in there. So, well, I want those berries picked. So I went home and I told Dad about this problem. I said, there's a wasp nest in there. When we can't pick the berries. Well, I'll look after that for you, he said. So he came back over and he said, stand clear. And boom! He shot that nest out of there with a shotgun. There wasn't anything left. The nest and every wasp had disappeared. They were blasted out of sight. So if you ever have a wasp nest, keep your shotgun handy. Try that now, you'd be. But that was everybody had guns in those days. You shoot robins out of the cherry trees and all these problems. Anyway, part of this picking berries bit was to try and save up enough money to buy a new bicycle, and I finally got my $45, which was required for my new CCM bicycle. And I felt so, look at me on this. And my sister, Judy, she wanted a bicycle too, but she had to save up $46 because girls' bikes cost $1 more than the boys. So, but she eventually got her extra $1 and she got her bicycle. And to get from Victoria to Vancouver, the only way there was by taking the CPR boat from Victoria. It left at 1 o'clock at 1 p.m. and again there was a midnight boat that went from Victoria to Vancouver. So we went both ways, but that was the only way off the island, was going by the CPR ship. It would sometimes pull into Sydney Wharf and pick up passengers from the Sydney Wharf. And you remember all the streetcars in Victoria? That was the main source of getting about too. So those are just some of the things I remember back in the past. George. Another thing that George Winterburn and I did, one day we were digging a fort or something, a hole, and we found in our diggings we came across an arrowhead which had been left from the natives, and that started my interest in native things ever since. So I'm always looking. Even though I'm not thinking about, if I ever see an arrowhead when I'm raking in the garden and stuff, my mind actually picks up. I've got about 30 of them there. I've picked up just around in our own yard and locally. There's surprising how many are out there. And somebody from the museum came out and saw them, and they said there was all different types. And he said, that one's from 1,000 years ago, that one's from 400 years ago. And then when the salesman from Japan came with the next model, they'd pick out a different one. But they're different. All these different shapes they had. And also on the table there's some things that came from via my grandmother. There's 2 arrows over there. They came from the Calgary, or at least from Cochrane area. That's where the ranch was. And also there's the, I guess you call it be a sheep's skull that has been used carved out and is used as a scoop for. My grandmother used it in her flour bin, this scoop, but it's just a skull of a sheep that they made. It's surprising how the natives were able to, all the different things they were able to create without the store to go to. If they needed something, they found a way of making it. And I was, after I was in grade about 11, Jack Armstrong had Claremont Poultry Farm, which is on Claremont Avenue, and he was gradually expanding it, and he asked me if I wanted to come to work. So I said sure. So then after grade 12, I kept on going. So I eventually became a partner with him. But in those days, all the birds were raised out on the fields. These your young birds. There's pictures of the birds on the field, and there's at night time you'd have to have you had your coon hunts. I never ever remember ever catching one, but we had flares we put out over the birds at all the different shelters throughout the fields. The flare, you remember the round flares that were used on the highway to mark before they had the battery operated one. They had the oil-fired flares, and we used those each night. And one of the chores each night was to go light the flares. Anyway, I was on the farm for 36 years, and by this time Terry Marson had come in. He was one of the partners. But after 36 years, Claremont Poultry had grown from 2,000 birds when I started. We had 24,000 laying hens on that farm by the time we finished, and we supplied many different stores in Victoria, and it gradually got more and more. We needed more and more eggs all the time. But our first vehicles, to deliver the eggs, we used our cars. And when you bought a car, you had to bring it out to the farm to see how many eggs you could get into it. So I bought a 1959 Pontiac Parisienne two-door hard coupe, and it came out on the farm, and I could get 15 dozen boxes of eggs in that. The back seat was never in the car for the first 5 years I had it, because that was our truck. And I still got it. The car is still there in the garage. It still goes. It's given great service over the years. We eventually had to go to trucks themselves, but those are just some of the things we did, raising birds on the farm there. And I guess the last thing I want to tell you about it, when eventually I got married in 1965. I had lived at home until the about age of 28. And I think my mother, I realize now, my mother and her friend Kathleen Tuckey, I ended up getting, about 10 years ago, I realized I was in an arranged marriage. I guess mom said, this kid's never ever going to leave. So Kathleen Tuckey's daughter, Jean, she worked in the Bank of Montreal at Royal Oak, and she was asked to look out for somebody for me. So she said, there's another girl who works down there, Ellen Walker. She's the right age. So she arranged for a party, and we went to a party and played Monopoly, I think it was. And then a week later, Mom said, did you ever phone Ellen back? And I said, no. Well, why not? She dialed the number for me, I think. Get on with it. Anyway, it eventually worked out, and we did get engaged and got married. And we eventually got married in 1965, and we built a home on. I had bought an acre of land previously a few years earlier. I'd bought this acre of land over at off Halliburton. It was only 500 feet from where our house was, but it was. Andy Gibb he had a strawberry field, and he had a 2-acre field, and he wanted to sell it for $3,500. And I was told, there's no way you're going to spend $3,500 on 2 acres of land. So I talked to Andy. He said, well, I'll sell you the back acre for $1,500. So in those days, you didn't have to go through all this rigmarole going through the municipality. You just drove with some sticks in the ground, and there you go. And so I got my acre for $1,500, and he divided the front acre in 2 half-acre lots and got us $1,000 each for him. So he got us $3,500. But anyway, so I still have this land. I've been moving into this house for 58 years now, and nothing much has moved out. So it's just chock-a-block full of. I keep collecting stuff, and I keep collecting more and more things. So when my time comes I want to die before I have to move. Because I don't want to have to deal with all this stuff. I've told my son about that, and Brian says, I've already ordered the dumpsters. And I've noticed these dumpsters keep driving around the block here about every week. There's one goes around looking to see if it's vacant yet. But so I think that's basically all I've got to say at the moment. If there's anybody's got any better questions get better information than you've already had, please ask.
Can you tell us the name of your children? Did you have boys, girls,
okay,
or what did you have?
I got Bruce, Brian, and Sarah. Bruce was born, well, I guess Bruce and Brian are about a year apart, and then Brian and Sarah are only 11 months apart. I don't know how we managed that, but anyway, they all live on the island. Brian lives out on Stellies Cross Road. He works at Butchart Gardens. He's in charge of all the night lighting out there. And Bruce works as a technician in Nanaimo Hospital. I think he got interested in, back up a bit. Remember the bus accident they had at Claremont had for the Mount Washington, the bus crash, the school? He was involved in it, and he was badly injured, and he was unconscious for about 10 days. And I remember Mom and I used to go up and visit him each night, and eventually on one side went up, and he'd waken up, and he said, "Why am I here? What happened?" So, but he was quite bad. There was a couple of children got killed in that bus accident too, but Bruce, he was really banged up, but the treatment he got, I think, convinced him that anyway, he ended up working for the medical field. And my daughter Sarah, she lives out in View Royal. She's got 3 children, one of whom lives with us. My grandson Peter lives with us, and all the grandchildren are now, I guess they're all classed as adults now. The youngest one's 17 and the oldest one's 26, so they're all just on the verge of all being in adulthood. And they're all, but it's very handy having children living nearby. They come and do all sorts of chores for me. So as I start going slower and slower, they help me maintain what I've got. So I think, and I have a sister, Judy. She lives in Abbotsford. She was a nurse, and she moved to Abbotsford with her husband, Jeff Horner. He was a school teacher, and he's now passed away, but she's still living over there. And anyway, any more? Anybody else want?
The awards up on your board there for your eggs, Peter, at fairs.
Those are different. We used to enter eggs into when I was on the farm, earlier on when we had the eggs, we'd enter eggs into all these different fairs, and we'd end up getting quite a few ribbons for from PNE, and some went to the CNE, was it National Exhibition. We got one ribbon from there, and so that's how those came about. Just part of and there's other pictures up there on the farm showing the birds on the range. And a lot of pictures. Pictures over there on the table are before and after type pictures. Like, for example, you got the picture of the hotel at Royal Oak, then the service station, the Petro-Canada's there now. And across the road was the old blacksmith shop, which became Wilner's Garage, and is still there as it was a tech show, but it's now just a repair shop. And there's one there for an ad I got from 1920 magazine for Sydney Mills. That's out in Sydney. There was the lumber mills out in Sydney from 1920, and it shows them. There's a picture there of the huge log, the timbers. They had these on the railroad car loaded with, looked like 24-inch diameter square logs, but 60 feet long. I don't know how the trees sure grew big in this area back in those days. And the picture there, the engine that was used for the railroad out there. There's the 3 railroads went through Sydney, and the CNR was the one I think where the logs were being loaded onto. But anyway, so I've tried to get some pictures of before and after type scenes over there. Oh, and the other one was the arrowheads. Those are ones that George and I think I talked about them, how the arrowheads, I'm never thinking about arrowheads, but every time I'm working in the garden, these little stones will show up. Occasionally one shows up and it's an arrowhead. And some flat stones there are being used for grinding things. And the 2 arrows up there are from Alberta. That's what came via my grandmother. They're arrows with the bone points. And if you look on them, the feathers are arranged on the back of the arrow, so when they're fired, they would spin. The feathers would cause them to spin. So if you got shot by an arrow in Alberta, they drilled into you.
Peter, when you were courting your wife, what adventures did you go on, or did you go on any adventures? Anything you could tell us about that was kind of fun, surprising?
I never did anything very much. Being on the farm 36 years, we started work at 6:30 every morning and worked till 6 o'clock every night. And so I never actually did many holidays. After I retired, we did do a cruise to the Panama Canal cruise, and we did another one was from New York up to Montreal, but called that the Fall Foliage Cruise one. And we did one recently, which is still 10 years ago now. We went to Alaska on one cruise. That's all I've ever done on.
Did you have what happened on anything exciting on these cruises other than normal conditions, or?
No, I just really enjoyed it. I like the Panama one, where you go through the Panama. The canal is only about 6 inches away from the ship. I don't know how they managed to fit those things through there, but and the Alaska one, I enjoyed that one very much. Seeing all the. Yep. Otherwise, any more questions?
You talked about the railroad going behind the school.
It was down below the West Saanich Road. It'd be on the, if you're facing west, it'd be on your right-hand side. It was behind the Women's Institute Hall.
So it wasn't the interurban, because the interurban.
No, there are 3 roads out in Sydney. The interurban was one. That was the electric one. That was put in when the interurban was created, when the power plant was at Brentwood Bay.
Yes.
And the interurban that was how the power lines got out there. So the interurban went all the way out to Deep Cove, actually.
Yes.
And then the CNR one, which was, they didn't call it CNR, they called it the
Canadians.
Anyway, it went out via on the Corridor Bay Road. Well, Corridor Bay Road. It's on Lochside is the old railway track.
Yes.
But this one through here, the VNS, Victoria Sydney Railroad, the first one, it came out through Royal Oak, and they had to move it once when they created at Beaver Lake, when they created the enlarged Beaver Lake to put the dam into because it was the water supply for Victoria.
Yes.
The railroad had to move over to the west, and it followed, but it did follow the side of the lake all the way past Elk Lake is still the embankment for it, and it went south through Saanich and back out into Sydney itself.
Yeah, the reason I asked, because in my mind, I sort of remember years ago the Wilsons saying they used to go to Royal Oak School, but they lived out Prospect Lake, and they could get the train.
Yeah, that would have been the
to go to the Royal Oak to go to Royal Oak School. So that's why I'm sort of surprised, and I thought, well, the interurban would be too far over for them to get to Royal Oak.
But interurban, we went right by the bottom of the Saanich Mountain. That's how they got some of the telescope supplies for the observatory up there.
You mentioned that the cement around Beaver Lake. So were you riding around the water?
They had a cement slab. Well, like it's on the east side of the lake where the swimming area is now. There was a flat spot, and they had a cement pad on there, and it had the lines marked on it for different races. But that was, I don't think that's probably not there now. I'm sure that's all been pulled out. But
Peter, I want to talk about your father, who was a scoutmaster.
Yeah.
And he practiced at the
Scout Hall down the road.
Down the hill, and I went there for several years. He was the scoutmaster. I don't remember if you were part of the troop at that time, were you?
No, I was never actually a scout. I was in Cubs, but then I'd had enough of that. Well, I'd had enough. At least I got involved in a lot of the scouting things, but I was never actually an official scout.
So I was wondering about your father. I was wondering, did he have something before the scout hall or afterward, or what did he do?
He retired from. He worked in the custom. He worked at his job was working in the customs house in Victoria for the mail customs, but that was his job. That was his lifetime job. But he did scouting. He used to go out to. He'd take his holidays in the summertime with the scouts, and we children would go over to Vancouver to visit my aunt and uncle over there. But he took them out to the scout Camp Bernard.
Oh yes.
Yeah, that was his holiday, and he loved picking cherries and berries and stuff for Mr. Van Trate.
Good. Well, thanks. Yeah, there were two other boys, the Wheeler boys, that were also scouts. They lived down the hill, halfway
Yeah.
downhill. Some of you may know of that. And
Ian,
then there were
Enid Ball's brother, he was a scout. There's a picture of him over here of Dan Cuthbert.
yeah, and then there were two Hill boys, John and his
Yeah, John and Peter.
younger brother, and
John
they
and-
lived out in Saanich. And their father came with a tiny little van and picked them up and took me up back home to the observatory, foot of the hill. And I used to walk up the hill at night after scouts that way.
Yeah.
But that's my association with your dad.
Yeah, well, I know
Thanks.
my dad knew he and your father got together. They're both interested in stamp collecting and that type of thing.
Yes, they were. Yeah, they were. Thank you, Peter.
And thank you very much. But it was because of the this Royal Oak historical group that got going, that got me very, very interested in all the different stories people told. People could live on the opposite side, across the road from you, and they have a totally different outlook on life to what you had. It's just really impressive, all the stories you people have got. Thank you.